So we're looking now at a Madonna and Child by Cima da Conegliano. And Cima is said to have painted in the Netherlandish style. And I was wondering if you could speak to that while we're here with some Netherlandish works just to our left.
Well, Vasari says that Antonello da Messina, who was a painter from Sicily, from Messina in Sicily, was the first Italian painter to actually master oil technique, which he identified as really being a technique associated with Netherlandish painters, with Van Eyck and so on. We know, in fact, the story is very much more complicated than that, but nevertheless, this is an early painting by Antonello up here of the Virgin and Child, and with this very elaborate jewelled crown, and it's immediately clear that this artist had looked at a lot of Netherlandish painting. You can see immediately from this early work by Antonello da Messina that he has studied Netherlandish painting. I mean, this partly comes from the shape of the angel's wings and things like that. And indeed, the very fact that Christ Child has got so many clothes on is rather characteristic of Netherlandish painting. But technically, if one wanted to fix on just one thing that oil painting could do better than any other form of painting, it would be the painting of jewels, because of the glazes enabled one to have this glowing translucency in stone. So this picture absolutely covered in precious stones. They're studied this crown of the Virgin to an almost irritating degree. Now you see something of the same quality in Cima, but he's painted this at daylight, or I think it's dawn probably, don't you? It could of course be dusk, but and this too was probably owed something to Netherlandish painting. The detail, especially in the landscape and the aerial perspective, these must have been things that people had seen in Netherlandish paintings, but this is studied, or restudied if you like, from the actual landscape of the Veneto. The landscape, of course, of Cima's hometown, of Conegliano. It's very likely that any patron of Cima, anyone who could afford to buy a beautiful picture like this from Cima, would actually have had some property in the foothills of the Alps that you see in the background here. And so that would have been delightful, but the Virgin doesn't quite belong in that landscape.
No.
But it's still very remarkable. There's this preference for painting her against a landscape background. You feel that within a few years, the Venetians had completely mastered aerial perspective and actually the effect of dawn light. But of course, the light on the landscape and in the landscape is a different light from the light that's actually on the Virgin and Child. You find that also even in the Bellini painting of Christ in the garden, and the agony in the garden, where dawn is just breaking, but there's a different type of light on the foreground figure. The Virgin rises above the landscape, so both heads are against the sky, and that somehow makes them more majestic.
There's an awful lot going on in the landscape.
Yes, it's busy and it's full of what looked like quite convincing contemporary architecture. That's to say, half historic, half modern, which is what you would expect. Farm buildings built out of older buildings and relatively recent bridges. There's nothing
fantastical, the way sometimes you have a Netherlandish painting where you have fantastic vistas. But it's open too. So we have the description of actual buildings, but there's something about the landscape here too that's evocative, and it lets your mind wander almost.
Yes.
It reminds me perhaps of the function of, an interlaced border around a gospel page. So you focus on the Madonna and Child, and then you can let your eye wander around the edges and your mind meditates.
The parapet's an extraordinarily important feature of these Venetian paintings.
The parapet allows us to become a part of the picture. It brings us closer to the Madonna and Child. We seem to be a part of the psychological space right in front of the two, because their gazes are both coming out here. And the parapet, as it truncates the figures, it also squashes that foreground space. But in so doing, as you noticed, it was really kind of too small for her legs. It does bring us closer to them.
Yes, it's a paradox in a way, isn't it? That by providing a barrier, you nevertheless establish some sort of psychological relationship, because it means that there's a ledge over which there is, across which there is the Virgin, onto which the Christ child might come down. Traditionally, I suppose, the idea of the Virgin and Child in the landscape is one which we associate with the Madonna of Humility, where she's actually seated or kneeling or whatever on the ground. Again, at the Nativity, she is she spreads out her own cloak, and the infant Christ is placed on it. And in these settings, you would expect some sort of landscape. But here, actually, she's the Virgin seated on a block of marble, which I suppose is a throne-like thing. But you once relate her to the landscape, and you can distinguish her from it. And you can at once relate her to your own domestic circumstances, and yet she's beyond it, which I think is what the parapet does. These paintings, of course, tended to be kept in people's bedchambers. I say a bedchamber is a rather old-fashioned kind of word, because the bedroom didn't really exist in the Renaissance, I don't think.
Right.
But some sort of room which was also a reception room, but also a private room, and a room which was frequently used. So you can imagine people going in and out of that room and always seeing the Virgin, who seems to be looking at us. Well, that would have mattered a lot. I suppose this looks forward in some ways to the poetic landscapes that we get later on in Venetian painting, which we might be looking at, because you have animals grazing and so on, but it doesn't have, there's nothing really fantastical about it. It's pleasing and it's pastoral, if you like, but it's not poetically pastoral quite yet, to my mind.
So here we are in front of the Bacchus and Ariadne by Titian.
Of course, it's one of the greatest paintings in the National Gallery, one of the most famous, and acquired quite early on in our history, having been exported from Rome. Having been a famous painting in Rome throughout several centuries, but painted for the Duke of Ferrara, for Alfonso d'Este, for a special room in somewhere between his palace and his castle, if I can put it like that. And this special room was intended originally to contain masterpieces by a variety of artists, but it ended up by being a room almost entirely full of paintings by Titian. There's one painting by a local artist, Dosso Dossi, which we haven't traced. And there was a painting by Bellini, which is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Right. They must have all been tightly framed around the room in a kind of frieze. I think this is the last of the paintings for the room. In Titian's two earlier pictures, which are now in Madrid, the Bacchanal of the Andrians and the Children's Bacchanal, or the Worship of Venus, as it's sometimes called. In Titian's two earlier pictures, Titian follows an ancient text, which he must have been given in translation, a text by Philostratus called the Imagines, which describes paintings in an ancient Roman art collection. And he follows it really exactly. But in this picture, he takes many more liberties, of which the most important is that he actually combines two sources, one from Ovid's Art of Love and the other one from Catullus. They are both very pictorial. They hadn't previously been combined, so it showed, I think, a confidence in Titian. In my opinion, that's one reason why I think this is the later of, or the last of these three. It's also, I think, the most daring, because Titian's trying to do things here that no one's ever done before, like showing someone in mid-air, because in fact Bacchus is actually leaping out of that chariot. But it shows you that painters are trying to do totally new things at this date. But I think that in relation to antique sources, of course this painting is just as remarkable because it incorporates a good deal that Titian has learnt from ancient art in one way or another. I mean, you couldn't really produce this tangled mass of figures on the right here without having seen a great many ancient sarcophagi, and of course, above all, perhaps, this figure struggling with snakes. Now, you might find some reference to that in the literary sources, but it seems very, very hard to believe that Titian would have invented that without some knowledge of the great statue of the Laocoon, uncovered in Rome sometime before this. But at the same time, it incorporates so much of the new language of the High Renaissance, informed by the study of antiquity. For me, the degree to which it's a response to ancient poetry and the degree to which it's a response to ancient art is pretty much equal in this work.
Well, and his confidence, as you say, in using multiple sources, would you say he's deliberately trying to rival both ancient poetry and ancient sculpture?
It's difficult to know to what extent people thought in those terms in the Renaissance, but to some extent they certainly did. They were always thinking in the terms of what can painting do that sculpture can't do, what can sculpture do that painting can't do, and of course, there certainly is a lot of sculptural reference in this, but equally the sense of air and atmosphere and light, something that a painter can achieve what a sculptor definitely can't, and I'm sure that is an important aspect of this work.
And in terms of its response to poetry, the painter can show us multiple moments all at once.
Ariadne has been looking out to sea and wandering dishevelled and sad by the shore, and you can just see the boat in the far left, but the boat is almost hardly more defined than the distant clouds, and that is actually a very important part of the story. And I don't think it's really a very obvious part of the painting. So most people looking at this picture would not say, woman, boat, someone's left her, and that's actually vital to the poem.
It is, but her gesture emphasizes her heartbreak, right? She's reaching out to the ship almost.
That gesture, it's a marvellous pose. I actually don't think myself that this is Titian's most successful narrative painting in the sense that his later paintings for Philip II are. It's a hugely magical painting and it's about sudden change in people's lives, and she's going to become the stars, and so of course he's included the stars already, right. Which again confirms what you said. The painter can refer to what happened before and what happens afterwards, whilst concentrating on one particular moment, which is the leap. No, it's an extraordinary painting. This painting was bought actually as a work which had something to do with Giorgione by Frederick Burton, who was director of the gallery at the time. And I'm sure he realised that it had some connection with a couple of paintings which are in the Uffizi. And we hang it next to the Adoration of the Kings, which I think is as secure a Giorgione almost as any. It's a very idiosyncratic picture, though. The faces are very odd, and they're very, very, very like those in one of the paintings in the Uffizi. The landscape is very, very similar to some things that you see in Giorgione's paintings, and perhaps the landscape is more remarkable for its fantasy than for its. It's got very naturalistic aerial perspective, but this is a very, very weird rock formation. You can just see there's a hermit in an extremely dangerous-looking cave. 3/4 up. Yeah. And it's also got it reminds one of some of the earlier 15th century pictures, which include studies of animals, paintings by Pisanello, for example. The animals, each animal seems to be a kind of separate specimen, studied slightly comically, actually, in profile. So there's a little bird in profile on the branch just above this strange baldacchino, and there's a peacock facing one way in profile, and then a cheetah facing the other way in profile, and then a deer and so on in the glade in the middle distance. And whether they've got anything to do with whatever's being depicted in the picture, I think is a very uncertain. So no one has ever come up with a completely convincing subject for this painting.
Perhaps that was the intention.
There are paintings which are definitely deliberately mysterious. But equally, this could be some scene from contemporary romance that we just haven't recognised.
Well, in comparison with the Titian that we were just looking at, it's quite a departure, because Titian wanted us to recognize the ancient source, the ancient story in the Bacchus and Ariadne. And here, perhaps the patron was trying to stump his visitors to his cabinet or studiolo.
I'm inclined to think that it quite likely was painted as a kind of as mysterious subject.
The use of landscape here with the exotic animals and the more ordinary animals and the birds and so forth, but in particular the landscape and the long vista off to the misty mountains and the interesting architecture, that seems to be as much a part of the subject as the human figures. And it seems to me that the Venetian artists at this time are making a big contribution to the development of the pastoral.
Yes, I'm sure that's right, and it's clearly a landscape which is based on actual study of real landscape forms and so on. But there is something ideal about it, which is made more idealized by the fact of these animals so unconcerned by each other. But I think the confusion of strange old men living in caves and a slightly classical subject matter, that's probably characteristic of the romances of the time. But yes, it's at once you feel there's a new understanding of nature and at the same time a desire to represent some nature in some earlier form than that which we know it, a more magical form and perhaps a more harmonious way of life and a setting.
One of the things artists were thinking about at this time was also ancient poetry, and seeing the poet crowned with laurel made me think of Virgil and the eclogues, and I might include a copy of the eclogues in the exhibition that we have in our rare book collection.
And that would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure that's right.
So,
absolutely. This is a painting which suits the eclogues very, very well.
In the 16th century, artists were displaying their knowledge of antiquity not only by referring to works of ancient sculpture, as Titian did in the Bacchus and Ariadne, but also by way of displaying their knowledge of their literature and rivaling that as well.
Yes, and of course, what one doesn't know very often is to what extent this is the contribution of the patron and the patron's advisors and the court poets and the like. Because this is the sort of picture which one thinks of as a courtly picture, even though if it was painted for a Venetian patron, there is no court in Venice. Similarly with this artist, we don't know whether, but I suspect that the whole thing was invented by this painter. But we'll never know, I fear. One interesting aspect of Renaissance art is that you do tend to start getting paintings of saints, and then they sometimes come with a landscape setting. So if you paint John the Baptist, you can paint him actually in the wilderness. If you paint St. Jerome, who's a very, very popular subject, occasionally you'll see him painted in his study, but usually he'll be painted in the wilderness. And if you're painting the wilderness, then that is the landscape, of course. So he has a landscape setting. But two things about David and Jonathan that are very, very peculiar. Firstly, it's not a saint exactly. And they'd have a separate independent painting of an episode from the Old Testament, which is clearly not part of a larger altarpiece complex or anything like that. That in itself is unusual. And then it's given a landscape setting. It's very hard to think of anything quite like it. But it requires, especially because it's a semi-narrative painting, it requires a sort of landscape setting. I do wonder whether it might not be what you might call an onomastic painting, something to honour a named saint. And David was quite a common name. So that's a theory which I'm just throwing out, because people were very, very interested in venerating their named saints. I think it's very unusual. It's a very, very unusual painting. But why David and Jonathan? It is a mystery. It's a mystery. It is a mystery. In fact, some people have thought it might be a different subject. You know that. Yeah.
Yes. Because it doesn't really correspond to the scriptural account. With Jonathan does not accompany David to go back to the king with the head.
Are we allowed a kind of little bit of ignorance in this interview with the director of the National Gallery? I think it's a good idea. It will encourage other people. By the time this painting comes back from Randolph College, we expect
we'll have it figured out.
We have it figured out.
Indeed.
Exactly. Yeah.